Christ is among us. This is Father Demetrius, pastor of St. Matthew's, the parish of the Greek Orthodox metropolis of Pittsburgh, the Archdiocese of America, a parish that is open for all who seek Christ. I want to welcome you to our part 3 of the Preamble to Lent. And this time we're going to focus on the Last Judgment Gospel, the Sunday of the Last Judgment. 2 Sundays before Lent starts, the Church focuses on and recalls the Last Judgment of Christ. And in a sense, we remember these things. The word to remember in Greek, anamnesi, means to recall or become present to. And there's a reality that's more than sentimental or simply mental, as it were, intellectual. One of the things, too, to know that there was a tradition in the Church for the first millennium at least, as we talk about now, the Last Judgment, the Parousia, the final appearance of Christ, that the Parousia would take place at Pascha. And that's a very powerful image when you think about the preparation for those who are going to be baptized, that in their baptism, then suddenly the event would become totally complete with the appearance of Jesus here at the end of time, on earth as in heaven. And that would affect also a sense of how the already existing members of the Church would approach Lent and the spiritual disciplines and so forth. How would we approach Pascha, if especially we knew that were going to be the case? And that's also true in the sense of understanding, approaching the resurrection of Christ as well. That there's this idea that if we knew Christ was going to appear and everything that took place and takes place in the story of the Passion and the death and resurrection of Jesus, how would we prioritize and arrange the schedules in our life in that way? So, something to keep in mind as we look to this. And so before Lent starts proper, we again celebrate, recall the Last Judgment. And again, I think that's something that frames a lot and so forth. How we recall not only the past, but recall the future. There's something in this, in the tradition of Israel, in the tradition of the scriptures, that it's not only looking back towards, but even in looking back, there is a looking forward. It's almost simultaneous. That when an Israelite, a Jewish person, celebrates Passover, they're not only remember the past, but they're looking forward to the Passovers to come. And in a sense, something that even greater along the way, a greater Passover, a greater act of God along the way that would take place in the future. People have talked about the meal the night before Jesus dies, the Last Supper, as we call it. And in the Last Supper, Jesus physically expresses what will take place through his passion that day, because the day, of course, begins with sunset. So sunset Thursday night technically begins what we call Paraskevi, or Friday, or the day of preparation. So that night begins, if you will, the whole scenario that is the stepping stone towards the Passion. And somehow in the reality of the Holy Spirit, that in that meal, that reality that will take place in the Passion of Christ and proleptically into the resurrection shoots into, if you will, the present moment of the meal where Jesus gathers his disciples together and he takes bread and wine and expresses that reality to them. Even there, and they get the taste of that, the taste of what will actually happen through the cross and into the resurrection. Hope that makes kind of sense in that way. That it's proleptic, coming from the future into the present moment. So there is that reality that seems to be very real in Scripture. And even, again, the word remembrance is not simply to think about something. We see that reflected in the story of the thief on the cross, who says to Jesus, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." And the response by Christ is, this day you will be with me in paradise. So remembrance, anamnesis, is to recall, to represent the reality that we're called to remember, in a sense. That remembering in this case is like if I forgot my keys at home, the biblical remembrance would be by remembering that the keys would suddenly become present on my person or before me. So it's not simply just an intellectual thinking or a sentimental connection, but an incarnational reality telescoping into our lives and us into the event, as it were, us getting a taste of the event. As I mentioned in the previous talk, that partaking of the Eucharist is even a taste of the marriage supper of the Lamb that is to come. And I use the analogy of my mother making a roast and waiting for the guests to arrive, making a nice dinner, and I was wanting a taste of it, at least something, because I was a little hungry. And my mother would give me, she would slice a piece of the roast and give it to me. And that taste was actually from the actual roast that would be eaten when everybody gathered together finally and have the meal together. Anyway, I want to move on to the gospel reading of the Last Judgment. And it's in Matthew chapter 25. And what we read here is when the Son of Man, the Lord is speaking here. And let me real quick mention that Jesus is sitting on the Mount of Olives. This whole pericope begins with chapter 24. And Matthew points out Jesus on the Mount of Olives. Now, in Jewish tradition, that's a very powerful image. Zechariah chapter 14 talks about the Lord coming and standing on the Mount of Olives. He's going to issue judgment from there. So in a sense, Jesus' presence on the Mount of Olives is a reality of speaking as the Son of Man, who God sends into the world to issue the judgment, to inaugurate the kingdom, and to represent the genuine Israel, as well as represent God himself to Israel, and so forth. So Jesus is sharing all this from the aspect of the Mount of Olives itself. So let me get here to Matthew 25. Jesus is on the Mount of Olives and he's speaking, and he says, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. And again, it's very interesting because Jesus is seated while he is sharing these parables, especially this one. And seated is the normal posture for a rabbi when they are teaching. But here is the idea of the Son of Man coming, and he will sit on his glorious throne. Son of Man is Jesus's favorite appellation for himself, his favorite phrase to describe who he is and what he's about. And that's from the Daniel chapter 7, and the Danielic tradition that follows. This idea that the Son of Man is not simply describing a human being, but his role as Son of Man is to effect, as I said, God's will, to inaugurate the kingdom on earth as in heaven, and to represent the genuine Israel, those who are authentically Israel, God's people partnering with him on his project to bring to completion humanity, the world, fully to rebirth, and so forth. In later writings and Danielic writings and the idea of the Son of Man tradition, scholars have pointed out that in Israel, coming towards the time of Jesus, it was understood that the Son of Man was not only representing Israel and representing God, but that he was seated on the throne with God as a distinct, if you will, person. A non-Christian Jewish rabbi scholar said, when you look at these documents and these images, it looks like a father and son team. And that either what we have in the Son of Man is a divine human, a human who becomes divine, or someone divine who becomes human. And this is before St. Paul is writing about these kind of things, and the apostles are seeing this, and of course it's embodied and manifest in Christ. So understand that the Son of Man, when Jesus talks about that phrase for himself, he's talking about in terms of that role, not simply being a human being. Okay? Okay. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. And all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Separating the goats and sheep was something normal in the life of a shepherd. And the separation was usually because the goats were often the first to be sold off, either to other herders or for the purpose of being slaughtered in that way. And the idea of the right hand in biblical thought also is very important because, like Jesus being seated at the right hand of God, symbolizes the issue of authority, shared authority, intimacy, and so on and so forth. So there's something about being on the right hand, and there's a closeness that's there. Then the king, the Son of Man, is also the king of Israel. The Son of Man will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world." Okay? The kingdom has existed in God himself since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you cared for me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. Now, that's a real powerful phrase in that way, and understanding all these things that people do. I think we need to see that this is the way the early church understood and lived in terms of its relationship, not only amongst themselves in the community, but also how they related to the world around them. And keep in mind, again, like I said, as we enter into Lent, that Lent was structured for the last stage of catechumens who were preparing for baptism. So the people hearing this gospel are understanding how they're relating to the new people. The new people are saying, this is the kind of community we're entering into. This is the kind of community we're entering into. This is the responsibilities we have as those who love Christ in terms of relating to the people and world around us. This is part of what membership means, what baptism means as we belong to Christ, and so on and so forth. So this isn't just some nice thing to think about. There is a reality here that's important about loving and sharing and so forth. Now, here's one of the interesting things in this gospel. Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? And when did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?" Then the king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you did it for me." Powerful statement. And I think if we understand the universality of the incarnation, the idea that Christ is connected to every human being that's ever lived and ever will live, that the image of God is in every person, and that through the incarnation, that reality is welded now into every human being. It clicks in a lot of ways that if you've done it to the least of these, you've done it to me. You've done it to me, whether you knew it or not. Whether you knew it or not. And I think this one of the things here is the fact of people not realizing they didn't have all that, maybe the theological understanding of all this right off the bat. And we're going to get to that in a minute, why, or what's being played out here. Then he, the king, will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you did not care for me." They also will answer, "Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger, or needing clothes, or sick, or in prison, and did not help you?" And the king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do it for me." Then they will go away to eternal consequences, punishment, but the righteous to life in the age to come. Now, both sides plead ignorance. When did we see you? When did we see you? But the difference is the righteous were doing this. And the excuse could be for those who were the unrighteous, if you will. Well, if I had seen you, Jesus, and known it was you, I would have related this way. In other words, I think doing things as like to impress God versus doing things out of a natural response to humanity because we've experienced the love of God and we want to share that with others and care for others the way we experience God's care for us. And I think that's the issue. Father John Bear, in a recent talk on the Second Coming, kind of made a point of this kind of thing that, this is like the natural condition of a Christian who understands the love and the mercy that we've all received. And if we understand that, we will share that with other people. We will share that with other people. And the concern of loving. And the epistle really for this Sunday is also the one about being loving. Don't scandalize people. If they're weak in the faith, don't do things to shake them up and just, not care. Help them, get more grounded in what it really means to be faithful to Jesus and the love that God has for them and the healing that is available in different levels. The idea of caring. That's an important thing I have to tell you, too, for me, where he says, I was sick and you cared for me. The Greek word implies not so much healing, but you clothed me. You took care of me. So I think that's really an understanding that doing what Jesus would do doesn't mean we have the success of seeing everything come out the way we want it to be. Working in hospice has helped me see that you just have to learn to be there for the person. Care for them. Provide care for them, regardless of the outcome. And in hospice, of course, usually people are there because they have 6 months or less to live. And are we that kind of a community that cares for people? And we're not going to just care for them depending on the success rate, whether it be just how many numbers of people we have in our church or what have you. You work with people who struggle with addictions or people who've been in trouble with the law or people who've had other problems. And there may be times that there's relapse or whatever, and people come back. I mean, it was the back and forth. And we can't take people's responsibility away from them. They are responsible for their faith and life. But the church being there to care for and provide a way to be supportive of them taking responsibility for their life. And it doesn't mean things are going to go perfectly. When we started doing an aspect of working with the jails and the prisons, and the idea that sometimes people who would get up might come visit our parish and even maybe become part of our parish. And the idea that it didn't mean everything would become perfect in their lives. Not everybody's life will go the way they want. People may struggle with different issues, appetites. People's marriages may not work out the way they ideally thought it would, etc. But we're still there to care for them and support them. And as I tell people that this idea of being part of the church it's not a race. I mean, Paul talks about it being a race, but I think it's more the idea of we're all facing the same direction. We're all facing the same direction. And some of us may be running the mile in 3 minutes, and others maybe almost at a crawl, but facing the right direction and trying to make some movement and keeping the focus of that direction onto Christ and trying to move towards him and let him come towards us and learning to be with God, letting ourselves learn to be with God and letting God be with us, letting him be with us. I think understanding that is a sense of the anamnesis. Again, remembering this. It's not just thinking about it. It's not just, how's our morality and taking a checklist and saying, okay, did I care for somebody who's poor? Did I help somebody in the prison ministry? Did I give a hungry person something to eat or whatever? Okay, good to see those kinds of things, but it's not just a checklist. The point of all this is the natural outcome of being in a relationship with God, of understanding what the role of the church is. And again, the last judgment isn't just about us as individuals. It's also about us in each community, that we will be judged as a community as well. And how does God see us? How do we see God? Metropolitan Anthony Bloom of blessed memory, who wrote many wonderful things on prayer and spirituality, an amazing personality, spoke of the idea of judgment as happening every time we have an encounter with God. There is a judgment. And judgment not as an arbitrary decision by God, but judgment as the understanding of a diagnosis. The church is talked about as a place for healing, a place for, like the hospital imagery that started around the 2nd century, that salvation is therapia. And I don't mean the kind of a deistic morality, self-help kind of thing, but the idea that every encounter with God, there's a diagnosis about where we are with him and each other. And the purpose is not to shame and condemn, but the purpose to say, okay, how do we let God help us readjust where we're not adjusted, to see where we're not seeing, to cooperate with God, to synergize with him on his project. Because what it means to be church, when God called Abraham and said he was going to make a people from him, as it were, that they were there to be a blessing to the world. And how are we a blessing? And this gospel is really pointing that the church, the existence of the church as an expression and foundation and basis of the gospel, presence on earth as in heaven, is there to reach out to the world. That when the Christian church would appear and be in a place, the poor, the hungry, the naked, the imprisoned, the sick would rejoice and say, this gives us hope, the presence of this church, this community of people who are cooperating and uncovering the presence of this God on earth as in heaven for us, for our salvation. And not just by doing nice moral things, but because God is present, it affects us and humanizes us, and to affirm the humanity by, in a way, also how we worship God. And how does our worship transform and reform how we see and how we are and who we are in that way? The thing, I think, I just want to start to wrap this up, because notice that all these things about, people worry about the second coming and all the wild theories that have developed in the last 60, 70 years, theories that really the early church, and for centuries the church never thought about and worried about, and quite frankly some of them seem contrary to the mindset of Jesus, the apostles, and their communities. Because whenever Christ talks about his appearance, in the Parousia, it would be the idea of how are we living when he comes, when he appears. And he does in the Gospels, especially in the Synoptics, he does talk about when the Son of Man will appear and his angels with him, the whole world will see him. And then he will call his chosen from the four winds. I think this shows that this is not a gospel for people who just think Jesus is going to help me escape any suffering or problems or tribulation. That there is going to be challenges in this. And there's something in the mystery of being in our fallen world that says suffering is what can be a tool to transform us into more of the reality of Jesus. That's really not just sitting back and waiting for God to give us a Mercedes and wealth and all that kind of stuff. It's a reality that's present for us. And Parousia, by the way, just to let you know, which is sometimes translated the second coming, but the word parousia, the way it was used in the ancient world, was like when an emperor or some royal dignitary was coming to your town, your village, your city, and the people would come to the entrance of the city to meet him and then escort him the rest of the way in to the city. He didn't come to the entrance of the city and the people meet him and then he took them out of the city and then later came back. He would come to the entrance of the city and they would bring him the rest of the way in, escorting him the rest of the way in. Parousia, to be fully present. And do we live as if God is present among us now, not just in the future, but the idea God present among us, transforming us. You know, in the Orthodox liturgy, we talk about the Holy Spirit coming to overshadow and be present upon the bread and the wine and us. And the idea that it's not simply bread and wine that transform. We are transformed. We are transformed. We partake of that bread and wine to become the flesh and blood presence of Jesus extended on to earth as in heaven. We become the hands and feet of Christ, present here on earth. And that's why the worship is to uncover that reality and help us open our hearts to that and let it be ingested to become incarnate in and among us. Something that happens in the mystery of worship that doesn't just happen, you know, if I'm just reading some of the Bible somewhere or thinking about Jesus or whatever, but something in that worship that organically transforms us as assuredly as when the Virgin Mary became pregnant with the presence of Christ. The last thing I simply want to say is something a professor of mine when I was going to Fordham University and taking some classes there. Talked about the second coming. There's this reality that Christ is everything, because we remember, like in the liturgy, we, you know, after the words of institution are presented, receive, eat, this is my body, drink of this, all of you, this is my blood, etc. The celebrant will say, recalling, therefore, the saving command, all that he's done for us, the cross, the tomb, the resurrection on the third day, the ascension to the heavens, the enthronement at the right hand of the Father, and the second glorious and awesome Parousia. To recall and be present to, again, remembrance means to have that reality present to us and us present to that reality. And it not only includes the past, but the future reality coming to us now because of what Christ has accomplished through the incarnation, death, resurrection, ascension, and so forth. And in a word, again, this is where I'm going back to one of my instructors from Fordham University, Father Edmund Hussey, God rest him, was the fact he used to say that when Jesus appears at the end of time, we will actually realize how much he's been here the whole time. And quite frankly, realize how much we did or didn't cooperate with him. So we live as if Jesus is here. And he's not in another galaxy, by the way. When we talk about the second coming of Christ, he's not somewhere else away when, like a woman who's pregnant says her baby is coming. The baby's right there. We have to start seeing things a little different, that even though it's beyond our ability to see, God is present among us. It's just we can't see him right now any more than a child in the womb can see outside of the womb. But the parent is there. The parent is actually, in fact, carrying him or her. So with that, as we look forward, are we relating like Christ? Are we really like Christ is here among us? Do we see him? Are we cooperating with what he wants to even the least? To even the least. Not the person that we think will bring a lot of money to the church or this or that or the other thing, to the least. To the least. And to see ourselves as, again, in that partnership with God, to work on his project, that our life is about his. He made himself into our human reality in order to bring us into his. So may the Lord bless us and all of you as we step in towards Lent with this awareness. And I, again, asking that if you're enjoying these talks, to please subscribe. And please remember St. Matthew's in your prayers, especially as we're moving slowly. Hopefully, some things being resolved with all the situations around us. To be challenged about being persons and even parishes that reflect what we talk about, that worship in a way that this becomes the outcome. That at the end of every liturgy, we know it's a good worship and good liturgy, not because the priest chanted nice or the choir was good or et cetera, but because we've become, like the bread and wine, with each worship, we become personally and as a community more like Jesus. We act more like Jesus. We walk more like Jesus. We extend ourselves and relate to others more like Jesus. The Lord bless all of you, and may we be coming into that deeper awareness as we move towards Lent, to see Christ present among us. God bless all of you.